Okay, so finally, Radicals for Capitalism. We are on the second to last chapter, I believe, before notes, and there are extensive notes. And this chapter, if I can find it, is called Twilight of the Libertarian Gods, which is such a sad name to me. It reminds me of the Xena episode, The Twilight of the Gods, when she got the ability to kill gods. All right. And I think didn't she kill Ares' sister? What was Ares' sister's name? Not Chaos, but something along those lines. Anyway, it's been a while since I watched Xena, but here we go. Starts with the 1980s and the 1990s saw, I want to get this microphone a bit closer to me, the passing of the founders and the founding influences of modern American libertarianism. Many had taken intellectual or institutional paths that removed them from the mainstream of the movement that their work and influence had built. Libertarianism never became so institutionalized that its major thinkers became trapped in their own past or their own success, separate from real political or even academic power. They could and did follow their own intellectual and personal whims. And I suppose that's good or bad, depending upon how you see it. I see it as good. So we're continuing here. It says, part of the tragedy of Ayn Rand's waning years is that she never had any idea of her cultural impact, of how many people deeply loved her. And that is sad. She was always in such a defensive mode. It says, Rand's radical opposition to the morality and thinking of the prevailing culture made her a consistent target of often cruel public criticism. As Mimi Riso-Gladson, author of a book on Rand, said, if she is not held in awe, she is usually despised. I can relate to that, not obviously at the level of Ayn Rand, but I've often joked that I make people feel something. It's of two extremes, either love or hate me, but at least I make them feel something. This is a case of tit for tat in the sense that Rand was rarely fair in any scholarly sense to her intellectual foes. Now, I hope that is not true of me. I try to be fair. She felt it perfectly appropriate, for example, to write lengthy critiques of books she hadn't read. I'd never do that. And she declared that one should defeat collectivists and altruists by the single method of contempt. Take away their aura of holiness. Look at them for what they are, parasites. I think people are more than walking bundles of ideological beliefs, and a Christian, and therefore do not despise altruism as well. Rand had declared a cultural and philosophic war, and she got, if not as good as she gave, at least in like manner. I suppose that's pretty fair to say. I don't think I often get in like manner. I get as good as I give, but I don't think it's in like manner. I do think it's often very unfair, but I'm sure everyone always thinks that about themselves. Daniel Yule and Rasmussen. This is still talking about Ayn Rand. And whether or not people granted her honor as a philosopher, it says they found many who did. J. Charles King challenged Rand's contention that only a being whose choices involved life, death, existence, or non-existence could have or could need values. Even an indestructible immortal could have preferences, things he enjoyed and wanted to pursue more than others, and surely that means he is pursuing values. Eric Mack questions the seemingly Kantian stream in Rand's conclusions about what is right for an individual to do. Rand, supposedly an individualist, ignores the fact that the things mankind as a group cannot do and survive, like live always and only as parasites on the productivity of others, are things that individual men can and in fact do all the time. Rand fails to prove, as a necessary fact of existence, that every individual man needs to practice the virtue of productivity. At best, productivity provides a good general strategy, not an unbreakable command. Now, while those are critiques of Rand, this was shown in this book to be proof that she was taken seriously as a philosopher, because you do not critique people you don't at least somewhat take seriously. You might critique them in a mocking way, but not in a serious way. Rarely do Rand's attackers deign to publicly name the essential ideas of Atlas Shrugs and to attempt to refute them. No one has been willing to declare, Ayn Rand holds that man must choose his values and actions exclusively by reason, and that man has the right to exist for his own sake, and that no one has the right to seek values from others by physical force, and I consider such ideas wrong, evil, and socially dangerous. They just go about it in roundabout ways. Says Rand was uncharitable. She didn't believe that other people's need or suffering constituted any claim on her life or anyone else's unless people chose to take on the burden because the happiness of the helped person was specifically valuable to them. In her notes for Atlas, she was passionate on this point. Quote, God damn it, I must put an end to the idea of misfortune as an all-embracing passkey and a forced mortgage on all life. That's what I must blast. Maybe not in the way she put it, but in the principle, I do agree with her. Someone else's need is not a claim on your life. She even concludes that some victims of progressive education might not be able to bootstrap themselves solely by their own efforts, a real concession for Rand. Rand's passionate belief in the possibility of individual, and that's one reason why I think altruism is important. Rand's passionate belief in the possibility of individual glory and greatness, as well as her burning admiration for it, central to her appeal, the reason why many intelligent, capable people bound themselves to her, often under psychologically difficult circumstances, for so long, the reason why she has millions of devoted fans and readers. People commonly refer to outgrowing an affection or admiration for Rand. Barbara Brandon speculates that people figured out how unpopular her ideas were, and maybe they didn't outgrow anything. Maybe they were just afraid to admit to it publicly because the wrath of God would descend on them from people they knew. Objectivism, and then we're on another page here, because again, we're just doing some summaries. Objectivism is a jealous God demanding obedience to a strict code and the forsaking of all others. As libertarians from Milton Friedman to Roy Childs have suggested, one got more positive value from Rand, the thinker, the farther one strayed away from Rand, the person. And I can see that as true. I tend to not like, from what I know, obviously I've never met her, but from what I can tell, and I'm looking at Twitter at the same time, just because, I'm obsessed, that's the major impression I get. I don't care for her much as a person. I do love her as a thinker. Now it goes on to talk about F.A. Hayek. And then it says in his book, Constitution, the book's major impetus was demolishing the concept of social justice, a task of which Hayek wrote, I have come to feel strongly that the greatest service I can still render to my fellow men would be that I can make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice. Social justice had come to its prominence in modern Western thought, Hayek maintains, as an intellectual and ethical cover for power and resource grabs by an untethered legislature. And I think I would agree with that as well. Once legislatures burst the confines of lawmaking in the old-fashioned sense, and claim the power to pass laws that treat citizens differently and grant special favors to some at the expense of others, the only ideological rein on government expansion is gone. Quote, man will have to recognize that it is neither his inborn instincts nor his intelligence on which his future chiefly depends. It is rather the institution of private property and markets which helps groups and societies thrive, even though they don't, understand why. Did I bring a soda down? I did. During his later years, Hayek grew obsessed with publicly and finally refuting socialism in the eyes of the world. His thoughts about his intellectual opponents became less charitable. As we read earlier in this book, if you remember, way back when we started, that people thought he was often far too charitable to socialists and socialism. And then he goes on to argue that, as the subtitle of this section says, that a successful free society will always be a tradition-bound society. And that tended to be what hippity-hoppity get off my property also claimed. That's very much a Hoppian idea. Despite his high reputation as an advocate for human liberty and against state control, Hayek's arguments in some ways provide more room for state power and less for individual autonomy than did those of his fellow libertarian giants. Though Hayek often advocates the private sphere as the key to preserving the extended order of human cooperation that allows us to thrive, he leaves a lot of room for state interference within that sphere, and does so with intellectual justifications that, some critics argue, aren't always coherent. But to posit preventing state intervention in people's lives as the primary political goal is to flirt with anarchism. And yes, indeed it is, and that's one reason why I'm an anarchist. And Hayek is no anarchist, which is probably why I don't have the abiding love affair with Hayek that other people seem to have. Those who take a quote-unquote rigid position, yeah, I'm very rigid against coercion, against such matters as government role in social insurance, education, or even subsidizing certain experimental developments, he insists, are taking a position which is defensible but has little to do with freedom. And I would say that is pure twaddle. Freedom, to Hayek, exists only under law. Hayek's reliance on evolution make his later writings sound more conservative than libertarian in some ways, despite his denying the conservative label. Hayek claimed that a presumptive reliance on traditional ways of morality, since they embodied the collective wisdom and evolutionary success of the ages above the feeble workings of any single rational mind, kind of denies the great man theory, though. It assumes that all single minds are feeble compared to the collective, was the only way for society to thrive. Consequently, it is easy to see how he could be mistakenly identified as conservative for statements such as, in Fatal Conceit, quote, "Virtually all the benefits of civilization, and indeed our very existence, rest, I believe, on our continuing willingness to shoulder the burden of tradition." I'm not willing to shoulder the burden of tradition. These benefits in no way justify the burden, but the alternative is poverty and famine. Do not agree. I think the upside is innovation and progress. And here's the title of the next section. The collective political wisdom of the ages was not worth a good set of forged steel hand tools. It says in 1986, the Libertarian Party brought back a blast from the movement's past to edit the LP News. Since the mid-1970s, Karl Hess had become a public spokesperson for community-based, liberty rooted in self-sufficiency and technologies manageable on a small community scale. In 1975, Hess published the first of two autobiographies, Dear America. The book is an interesting study of a man teetering on the edge between libertarianism and anti-property leftism. Wow. But I like how this book distinguishes between the two, because there seem to be some people in the Libertarian Party who have problems distinguishing between the two. He still believed that freedom is a great value. He's still contrary enough to think FDR was pushing social fascism, but he's no longer a full private property Rothbardian. He thinks corporations owe something to their communities and should not be free to just up and leave if doing so would harm those communities. Now, I don't think corporations are libertarian in the slightest, but substitute corporations in there just for large companies, and yeah, they should be able to up and leave. Are you going to force people? That's slavery to say otherwise. I'm sorry, I just cannot agree with him there. He has kind words for Fidel Castro. He worries as much about concentrated corporate and business power as he does about state power, as do I. And I think that's lacking a lot in today's libertarianism. The book's arguments mostly stand on the three legs of the Hessian stool: local freedom, workplace democracy, and technology as a tool of personal empowerment. The libertarian movement has been largely a movement of ideologues and activists inspired by ideologues. And that's me. I'm an ideologue and inspired, and an activist inspired by ideologues. Says Hess, though, was resolutely anti-ideological. So he and I probably wouldn't get along. Have gotten along. I think he's long since passed away, I believe. What really changes our world and the way we live in it are devices and innovations. I don't believe that's all mutually exclusive. If you want to know what is happening in a society at any point, look at the tools, not the rhetoric. Who says the two aren't related? For instance, in a society that's forging tools of war, it's fueled by rhetoric of war. Not the books, not the philosophy. Then it goes on to Rothbard. Rothbard finally published The Ethics of Liberty in 1982, a book 2 decades in the making. Ivan Beerley at the Volcker Fund had originally suggested it to Rothbard as a book bringing natural rights to libertarians and liberty to conservatives. Rothbard here presented the fullest explanation of the ethical philosophy behind his property-based anarcho-capitalism and let some of his truest radicalism shine through. For example, he says that a libertarian mustn't stand for merely protecting any existing distribution of property. Rather, he is interested in defending justly held property. When we can authoritatively say that a currently property holding is not based in an unbroken line of just possession and can find a victim or an heir of the victim from whom the property was taken, then that victim or heir must take possession. Now here's where I differ. Like, I do agree with him that it needs to be justly held property, not property for property's sake. But there's an assumption made here that I've grown to reject. And I've grown to reject this by seeing so many parents that can't stand their children. Who's to say that the just owner of a certain property would have wanted his heirs to get that property? We don't know that. So I think we also need convincing proof of intents. Intents, not intense as intensity. In practice, he thinks that because most lines of possession are so muddled, and I would say so is evidence of intent, that as a second best option, we should treat current legal property as homesteaded. I would agree. This land reform issue was brought up in magazine articles in the 70s by then Rothbard disciple Roy Childs editing Libertarian Review, and I would love to read those. I'll try to find them. Barely a word has been breathed about it from any libertarian publication or institution since. Maybe we can change that. Now here's a part that's very near and dear to me, because it almost made me abandon libertarianism, because I was becoming very convinced by full-on Rothbardianism until I learned that he didn't believe that parents had an ethical duty to feed their own children. And I became fully convinced that that was a morally monstrous point of view. I still believe it's a morally monstrous point of view. And if that was the logical implication of libertarianism, then I wasn't a fucking libertarian, because I could not believe in anything that logically led to a morally monstrous point of view. However, I've since come to my own arguments that I believe Rothbard was very, very, very wrong here. But this is what this part of the book will deal with, at least these next few quotes. The most controversial positions in ethics regard children's rights. Rothbard is perfectly willing to posit that a fetus is a full-fledged human with all the rights of a human being, but no more. I agree. And in his libertarian defense of abortion rights, he asks what humans have the right to be coercive parasites. Calling a human fetus a parasite is repulsive within the body of an unwilling human host. And I agree with him there, minus the word parasite, but he neglects, at least in the summary. And it's been a while since I read that portion of the book, whether he deals with the issue, and I believe he does, of the responsibility, like the fetus didn't just pop into there one day like, surprise, surprise, surprise. The people did something to put it there. And when you put another human life, well, we'll get into, I got into abortion a million times. My disagreements are well known. Clearly, no born humans have such a right. Not to live in a body, but they do have a right upon your resources if you negligently harm them. And therefore, the fetus can have no such right either. Rothbard delights in defending the shocking conclusions to which his pure property rights libertarianism leads. He insists, for example, that libel cannot be a crime. I agree. Crimes require attacks on person or property, but libel damages only someone's reputation. I agree with him. That's an intangible. You don't own other people's thoughts. Since your reputation consists of thoughts in other people's heads, it is not your property. Rothbard insists there's no particular right to immigrate or move anywhere in the world of strict private property. I disagree. I agree. Crap, I can't think of his name right now. Roderick. I agree with Roderick Long that there is a right of egress and ingress. Any such freedom of movement requires crossing other people's property, and one needs permission to do that. Because libertarians want justice, and they want it now, to Rothbard, a libertarian should always and everywhere advocate immediate abolition of any injustice, anything done by the state. And in theory, I would agree. I believe. I want to do a show on whether or not I would push Rothbard's button, that theoretical construct. I think that would be a good discussion. But in pure theory, I agree with him. He summons to his side the ghost of William Lloyd Garrison and the abolitionist moral fervor toward ending slavery. I don't think that's quite the same thing, because I would agree absolutely with William Lloyd Garrison. Rothbard does admit that the libertarian will often have to settle for transitional steps toward the ultimate goal of abolishing the state. That's fine, so long as the libertarian is always upholding the ultimate goal of liberty as the desired end of the transitional process, which is something that used to be a resolution of the Libertarian National Committee. But as you can tell by their recent email where they were too scared to say that our actual goal was the abolition of public education, that they do not, or to lack the courage to do this today. In the aftermath of the 1988 Ron Paul presidential campaign, Rothbard was repulsed by LP members who hated Paul's GOP past, straight-laced demeanor, and anti-abortion stance. Rothbard thought the Libertarian Party had been taken over by what he characterized as Luftmunchkin. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. A Yiddish term for people of the air, people of no fixed means whose method of earthly survival is mysterious. Rothbard, with Rockwell, began insulting these counterculture types. I'm sure he would have had quite a few words to say for me. In the pages of Liberty, Rockwell threw down the gauntlet with a controversial essay defending Paleo libertarianism, which I do not agree with. I don't agree with Paleo libertarianism, to be clear. Libertarian politics combined with cultural conservatism. But I wouldn't, go on the attack the way some people do. It's just not my cup of tea. So I don't drink it. Other people are free to do so. See anything interesting on Twitter here? Just because I threw a few bombs and I want to see if they landed. They did. This paleo-libertarian turn was not out of the blue for Rothbard. Even when singing the praises of the 1960s student movement, he always pledged fealty to old bourgeois cultural values. He loved pre-big band New Orleans jazz and old-fashioned narrative movies with the heroes or broad comedies. He'd regularly rag libertarians' concern with what he saw as faddish nonsense like humanistic psychology and science fiction visions of the future. I would disagree with him there. In his history of economic thought and elsewhere, he praised Christianity as the bedrock of almost all that was valuable in Western philosophic tradition. While other libertarians talked of living liberty, a phrase Rothbard detested, through daring experiments in unique and sometimes bizarre social arrangements, Rothbard declared even in the early 1970s that the Christian ethic is a rock of ages, and it is at least incumbent on an individual to think long and hard before he abandons that rock, lest he sink into the quagmire of the capricious and the bizarre. Well, I think plenty of people live successfully. I'm a Christian myself, but outside of that. But I do think when there is a deeply ingrained and successful culture and tradition that you should think long and hard. I mean, that's just wisdom. Since his death, Rothbard's stature within the larger libertarian movement has declined, and that is very sad. It certainly hasn't in my circles, but I understand my circles are not the wider libertarian circles. Certainly not the Cato circles. Reason magazine, to which he had been a contributing editor from 73 to 83, didn't even note his passing. Shame on you, Reason. That's disgusting. He is still, even in death, the linchpin of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and its concerns, focus, and tone. That institute, and that could be why I'm attracted to the Mises Caucus and the Mises Institute, is more spreading Rothbardianism than pure Misesianism. That's an interesting observation. Because he is still alive as a human being, often a contentious one in many libertarians' memories, Rothbard's reputation is still tied up in his personality and people's assessments of it. Delight with infighting and sniffing out heresy was certainly part of Rothbard's style. Not something particularly admirable in my view. It's like he got stuck in cage stage. I used to like cage stage when I was in cage stage, but it's something that I have mostly, I hope, grown out of. Some old associates, suspecting that if the world were to turn libertarian, Rothbard would become a statist, just to be contrary. His biography and old LP Radical Caucus comrade, Justin Raimondo, saw ideological entrepreneurship, a constant search for the most fruitful ground on which to cultivate support for what Rothbard always saw as the most important political issue, war and peace, which we see reflected today in Dave Smith. He thinks that is the most important issue. This idea, Raimondo posits, makes coherent sense of Rothbard's initial flight from the right to the new left and his later move toward Pat Buchanan, the search for the most politically potent anti-intervention force. And you want to know what? That did explain a lot to me, because his little ping-ponging there really was confusing to me. Rothbard himself once wrote that my ideological and political activism has been focused on opposition to America's wars. First, because I have believed our waging them to be unjust, and second, because war, in the penetrating phrase of the libertarian Randolph Bourne, has always been the health of the state, an instrument of the aggrandizement of state power over the health, the lives, and the property of their subject citizens and social institutions. And then it quotes Robert Poole. Rothbard was very important, particularly in the 1970s. He was the first to really popularize the term libertarian, to help get scattered people who thought this way to become a self-conscious movement. He helped instigate the split of the libertarian faction from YAF. He was a continual rabble-rouser and pusher of the envelope, and a great rhetorician in terms of shaping radical views. He'd switch tactical allies from one year to the next. Now that's what I did not care about for him. Loyalty is very, very prized virtue of mine, and I saw some disloyalty. But you had to respect his energy, his intellect, his skill with words, and some aspects of his vision. But still, in many ways, I thought then, and thought more as time went on, that he was a very divisive figure and a negative influence. Rothbard's social thought, quite unjustifiably neglected in the contemporary teaching of social science, represents a remarkable synthesis of economics, politics. I got pizza still on my face. Jurisprudence and the philosophy of social science, directed entirely at the problems and indeed prospects of a free society. His work constitutes perhaps the most powerful and sophisticated case for individualist anarchism. And his quiet and serious and relentless, now it goes on to Leonard Read. In his quiet and serious and relentless way, Leonard Read continued running the first modern libertarian institution, the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. But as the 1960s became the 1970s, became the 1980s, FEE and its central project, Freeman magazine, was more and more in its own alternate dimension path, running alongside the mainstream libertarian world, only occasionally impacting it, mostly by sending some eager young soul from the FEE world to the larger libertarian one. In a post-Goldwater world where many right-wingers tried, at least rhetorically, to embrace a more thoroughgoing free market position, and where FEE remained uninfected by anarchism, boo, third-party politics, or e-patering la bourgeois, FEE was more and more feeding young minds into the conservative movement's free market wing as well. And we're on the last paragraph of Twilight of the Libertarian Gods. Nearly 60 years after Leonard Read founded FEE. Just making sure this was still recording. I got alarmed there for a second. There are still, believe it or not, people out there who are not properly educated in the freedom philosophy. The libertarian remnant is larger and more varied. Technology and wealth seem more liberating than reading and contemplating the rightness of allowing people to do anything that's peaceful. Leonard Read was the first American to make a libertarian education in the modern sense his life's work. The state continues to wage non-defensive war, tax for the private benefit of others, and interfere in the economic and personal decision-making of its citizens. Leonard Read's mission continues. So the last chapter that we will be dealing with, sorry, I keep looking over here. This is like my monitor screen. I need to move it over when I'm not doing the show with Mike. That's why I have it over here. I need to have it right here. An Eternal Revolution is the last chapter. It goes from page 573 through 619. So not terribly long, and that will be the last chapter. All the rest is notes, which is quite extensive, and then we will start on a new book. But I've got all kinds of dog ears in here. I don't know if you can see a further research, resources to get, things to stick into Lpedia. What a fantastic book. So glad we tackled this one.